Good morning. Good morning. And I'd like to say hi to everybody who showed up in live lecture today and those of you watching from the comfort of your home or wherever you are. And today we're going to be talking about virtue ethics, and I am very excited. This is very practical stuff, good advice. It's been good advice for 2,500 years. It's going to be good advice for another 2,500 years, I'll bet. And this is the first of two official lectures, and then we're going to have a bonus lecture. So today we're going to be talking, well, we're going to be talking about Confucius, we're going to be talking about Aristotle, then we're going to be talking about the Stoics, we're going to be talking about the Epicureans and the Cynics. And then there is a bonus lecture. It is not required, but that bonus lecture will be on contemporary virtue ethics. Yes, there are people who still talk about virtue ethics, and they are very interesting. And if we think about our our major ethical theories or our approaches to ethics, and for the purpose of simplicity, have divided them into three families. We have consequentialist ethics, and here ethics, not surprisingly, based on consequences. And the most famous version is utilitarianism. In utilitarianism, we're trying to maximize happiness and minimize suffering, although there are, alternative permutations of the hedonic calculus, but really it comes down to pleasure and pain. Again, a type of moral realism because pleasure and pain are things that actually exist in nature. Deontology, we looked at deontology last time, and here ethics are based on rules, and we judge the goodness of an action based on whether that action conforms to a maxim or a principle or a rule developed in advance. And yes, divine command ethics are a form of deontology. But we spent most of our time looking at Immanuel Kant, and Kant developed a system of ethics based on universal reason. And really, what his system came down to was respect for autonomy. And we talked about the categorical imperative and the three different permutations of the categorical imperative. But I think if you want Kant in a nutshell, it's that we always treat people with respect and all of that, all of what that entails. Um, Finally, today we're going to be talking about virtue ethics. And so here we don't get a formula, we don't get a maxim, we don't get a rule, we don't get a hedonic calculus. There's no categorical imperative. How do we judge the goodness of an action? Well, we look at the character trait that motivated that action. We cultivate our character, we work on our character, we work on ourselves. And by doing that, we're creating a better society and a better world. And this has a lot of practical appeal. And so ethics are based on character. And this makes a lot of sense because sometimes moral dilemmas and situations unfold without time for reflection or the time to apply the hedonic calculus or the categorical imperative. And sometimes we just have to know intuitively. But of course, intuitions don't arise spontaneously for the virtue ethicist. They have to be cultivated through habituation. And so we practice being a good person every day. And when we are called to make a decision in the context of some, moral problem or moral dilemma, we will intuitively know the right thing to do, or at least the best course of action. What it culminates in is our character. What is the best type of character to have? What are the virtues? What is the best way to live? My goodness, all practical questions. Here is something you can take today and change your life for the better. And not only your life, you can change the lives of those around you because your decisions, your actions, your choices affect the people around you in profound ways. So we're going to be looking at Confucianism. We're going to be looking at Confucius and his intellectual progeny. We're going to be spending most of our time today on Aristotle. Aristotle's huge, very influential, and a lot of contemporary virtue ethics is really a kind of callback to Aristotle or neo-Aristotelianism, particularly Aristotle's conception of the good life, happiness, what he calls eudaimonia, the good life. And we want to think about, I mean, really, one of the big questions that is at the heart of virtue ethics is what does it mean to live a good life? What is happiness? And so we want to think about that, and you should be thinking about that. In fact, that's one of the most important things you can think about. We're all trying to be happy, but what do we mean by that? What do we mean? We're pursuing happiness. We're trying to be happy. We're trying to live a better life. What does that actually mean? Because if you don't know what happiness is, how do you know when you find it? Right? Doesn't make any sense. So you need to think about that. What is it exactly you're trying to achieve? There's so many people, they're despondent, they're wandering around. They lack a sense of purpose, they lack a sense of meaning, they struggle, they work very hard, and then there's disappointment and frustration because how how do they know? How do they know if how would they know if they find happiness if they haven't defined what happiness is? Right? A lot of frustration out there. I hope that you're as excited as I am about this material. Right? So virtue ethics. Virtue ethics describes character as the driving force for ethical behavior rather than duty as in Kantianism or consequences as in utilitarianism. Talking about character, having good character, cultivating virtue. You want to make the world a better place? Okay. Well, to make the world a better place, first, you have to make yourself better. And I don't know about you, but I am sick and tired about being told what to do and how to live by people who can't even get their own life together. How are they going to help us? Please. Okay. Now, again, I'm not a guru, right? I'm just a professor in a philosophy course. But, this stuff has been around for a while. And to me, a lot of it just seems like common sense. And I think that if you think about it, you may come to agree. And you can make the world a better place today. Just improve yourself a little bit, and that will have an astounding effect on your life and the life of everybody that you're connected to. Yeah, stop complaining about what other people are doing. Think about what you're doing. What are you contributing? Maybe the problem is you. Well, if you're having conflict after conflict after conflict, what's the recurrent, factor in that, what's the common factor there? You. So sometimes, and we've talked about this, how good people can do bad things, and most of the bad things that happen around the world are done by people who believe that they're doing the right thing or at least are justified in their behavior. And that's a sad fact, and that's a frightening fact. It would be much easier if we could conceptualize evil as something that's external to us and just out there. And but that's not the way it is. If we look at the terrible things that happen in the world, those terrible things are done by people who think that they're doing the right thing. And this is a problem, isn't it? So virtue ethics doesn't provide us with a formula for ethical conduct. Just that's impractical, for one, because real life situations are complex. Things are complicated. There's a lot of variables. Often, moral dilemmas and moral situations unfold without time for reflection. And these formulas, like the hedonic calculus or the categorical imperative, can be impractical. All right, let's see how virtue ethics treats lying and dishonesty. The utilitarian will probably argue that lying is wrong, in most cases at least, because of the negative consequences produced by the lying. And that is true, that lying usually produces negative consequences for 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 most people. Now, the Kantians will argue that lying is always wrong, regardless of any potential good that might come from lying, because it's a violation of every formulation of the categorical imperative, the lying promise, right? There's a there's a contradiction in fact, right? Who wants to live in a world that's filled with liars? All of that stuff, right? And it always kind of connotes a lack of respect. Like if people are lying to you, they're withholding the truth, trying to manipulate you or objectify you. Okay, that's wrong from a Kantian perspective. Absolutely. No exceptions. Well, how would a virtue ethicist evaluate lying? Well, a virtue ethicist would evaluate lying by what it reveals about a person's character and whether it promotes human flourishing. These are big questions. These are questions you have to think about before you're put into a position of should I lie, should I not lie? You have to address these major questions about what is a good person, what is a good society, how should I relate to other people. So generally, we know, I mean, just from experience, that truthfulness is a virtue. We know that through our experience. We don't like it when people lie to us, when we lie to other people. Sometimes it creates unnecessary complications and hurts other people. So, yeah, honesty generally is good. An honest person values truth because it sustains trust, integrity, and a healthy community life. And these are all things that contribute to our happiness. Yeah, I'm down for that. However, unlike strict rule-based theories, virtue ethics allows that in rare circumstances, a virtuous and practically wise person might judge that withholding or even distorting the truth might be the right thing to do. Like when the Nazis come to your house and are looking for Anne Frank in your attic, you lie. You don't give the truth to somebody that's going to misuse that information. That doesn't make any sense. So, as a general rule, you should tell the truth. You should encourage other people to be honest as well. You should set a good example. But you should not provide the truth to those intending to misuse it. Also, you need to learn discretion. Don't just say whatever is on your mind. That can be hurtful. You could harm other people's feelings. You don't want to do that. You don't want to be the kind of person. And we all know that when like there's somebody in our friend group and they pride themselves that they just say whatever's on their mind. Okay. I mean, there's always someone, well, I'm gonna just say it like it is. There's a time you have to sometimes say it like it is. Okay, I get that, but not all the time. Sometimes you just need to learn to shut up. Okay. And you don't always have to have an opinion. And a lot of, I mean, think of how the way that lies work in a practical way to facilitate human relationships is very interesting because we lie a lot. Somebody gives us something when we don't like it, like grandma gives you a gift and you don't like it. Do you say, grandma, this is terrible, I'm going to throw it away? Right? No, you say, thank you, I really appreciate it. I just love it. There are times when people need to hear the truth and you need to be able to do that. And that can be very uncomfortable, but not all the time, right? How about this? How about good to see you? It's not always good to see you. But like, look, this is the way that we negotiate social relationships. And we have to learn to do this. And we have to learn when it's appropriate and when it's not. All right. Confucius. Uh, wow. Master Kong. By nature, men are nearly alike, but by practice, they get to be wide apart. And this is a great theme for many of the virtue theorists that we have to cultivate our nature. We have to practice virtue. We have to habituate it. And simply knowing the right thing to do isn't enough. As we all know, because sometimes we know we're engaging in bad behavior. We just can't stop ourselves because we haven't we haven't habituated ourselves to virtue. So Confucian philosophy is a moral and social tradition centered on cultivating virtue, sustaining harmonious relationships, and maintaining social order through ethical self-cultivation rather than through law or coercion. So here the idea is the best way to ensure society functions is not through threats or coercion or law, but to internalize ethical standards so people simply know what the right thing to do and they practice the right thing to do. And so rather than focusing on abstract rules or a concept of individual rights, which itself is a pretty abstract idea, Confucianism is practical. It views ethics as being embedded in social roles and traditions. Now, why the focus on social roles and tradition and authority in Confucianism? And I think that we can understand exactly where Confucius is coming from. Ethics is embedded in social roles because the nature of the self. And we, when I say we, we're thinking in the Western philosophical tradition, humanism and political liberalism. There's the idea that, look, the individual is what is important. And our autonomy and our, even with Kant, it's all about individual autonomy and respect for that. The ideal in political liberalism, which is really the kind of political manifestation of humanism, is that the starting point for ethics and politics is the individual and individual autonomy. And what is the culmination of political liberalism is that we have a free society and the individual is free to develop and express themselves and come to be the kind of person that they want to be. And that's a beautiful vision, but in some ways it's unrealistic and it's limited. In Confucianism, and we're going to see this in communitarianism and other other challenges to liberalism. In Confucianism, the self is fundamentally relational. We are who we are because of our relationships with other people. And Aristotle will say the same thing. Aristotle will say humans are political animals. And he means that in a literal sense. One of the defining characteristics of humans is that we're social in nature. And so here the same for Confucius, a person can only flourish, truly flourish, only when they can harmonize their emotions, desires, and conduct with the broader moral consensus around them. So the purpose of life is self-cultivation, but within the web of social relationships, because these relationships make us who we are. We are sons, we are daughters, we are fathers, we are mothers, sisters, brothers, cousins, uncles, co-workers, fellow citizens, members of clubs. Identity, our fundamental identity is relational, it's social. So by cultivating virtue in myself, I contribute to social harmony, harmony in my family, stability in society, and ultimately order in the world. And the idea that the individual can exist outside of that is a fantasy. Confucius talks about the junzi. The junzi is a person who cares about their character and develops their character and wants to be a good person. And so the junzi practices self-reflection, recognizes and fulfills their duties and obligations, their social duties and obligations, and sets a moral example for other people, contributing to the functioning of a good society. It's just not all about me. It's about, well, it is about me, but the me that I care about is a relational me. And so I better myself by making those relationships around me and the institutions I participate in stronger. Now, in contrast to the Junzi is the Shaoren. And the Shaoren is a petty, narcissistic, egotistical person who only wants immediate gain. And this is, self-evidently bad. Although if you're paying it, like this has been normalized in our society for some reason. This is just a disaster. This idea that we get ahead at the expense of other people and we're not connected and it's just all about me and acting on my desires like a child. For the Junzi, the most important virtues are Ren, Yi, Li, and Xiao. Ren is our innate goodness, okay, our sense of humanity. And here Confucius says that people have this innate sense of humanity, of goodness, of natural, it is our natural moral disposition, our capacity for empathy and care and concern for others. Now, here's the thing though, this has to be cultivated. If it's not, it can die. The essence of Ren is in this very famous Confucian saying, don't impose on others what you do not wish for yourself, as a kind of guide to our humanity. And this, of course, very similar to what you might be familiar with in the Golden Rule. So, different cultures and different societies often come to the same conclusion, which is one of the insights of virtue theory, right? We're going to look at Aristotle. Aristotle is very, very similar to this. Human nature, maybe not that different, right? Environmental constraints are different, historical contingencies, geography, topography, but human nature, I mean, we all face the same problems. We all are trying to overcome the same limitations. So we come to the same conclusions very often. Yi. Now, yi is an interesting virtue. It is righteousness and integrity, the moral compass that guides our judgment. It is the capacity to act rightly for the right reasons rather than in self-interest. Yi is the moral insight which goes beyond simple rule following. It is the ability to judge how rules should be applied and knowing the right thing to do in any situation. So this is an intellectual virtue, but like, what actions are conducive to living a good life? What should we do? And it's not just about following rules, it's about how rules should be interpreted and understood in a particular situation. Finally, there's Li, and I think Li can be misunderstood as a virtue. And this is what a lot of people think about when they think about Confucianism. Li is respect for tradition, ritual, and order as a guide to human action. We are not born fully virtuous, so we must be guided by ritual and tradition. Virtue needs a pathway, a guide. So it doesn't, I mean, it's not something we can cultivate in a vacuum. Over time, these rituals, which may seem meaningless or empty, become internalized, and our individual emotions and desires are directed to appropriate social roles. So traditions and rituals aren't meaningful on their own, but as a really kind of as a vector or an avenue for the cultivation of character to help us internalize values that are good for society. Now, one of the most important virtues in Confucianism, along with respect for ritual, tradition, and social order, is Zhao, filial piety, respect for parents, right? Respect for one's parents and ancestors is considered to be, in Confucianism, the foundation of all morality. The family, and think about this, the family is where moral character is formed. If a person learns to respect, care for, and obey their parents, they will learn moral responsibility more broadly. And of course, the parents too have a moral responsibility to the children, to teach them, to guide them, to be good. Good families create good citizens. Good citizens create good government. But it all begins with the family in Confucianism. So a good society is built on virtue, not law. I mean, laws are secondary. Virtues are primary. The ideal Confucian society is one where people cultivate virtue, respect hierarchy, fulfill their duties with integrity and compassion. This, in turn, leads to a prosperous and stable community for everyone. So everyone is better, right? Everyone is better. The Confucian philosopher Mencius puts it this way very famously: love between father and son, righteousness between ruler and subject, attention between husband and wife, respect between elder and younger brother, trust between friends. This is an ideal society. Aristotle. Okay, we know Aristotle. We've talked about Aristotle before, and we know that Aristotle was a disciple of Plato to a degree, although Aristotle fundamentally disagreed with Plato about many things. And that's kind of encapsulated in this great painting, The School of Athens by Raphael. And you can see here's Plato, and he's thinking about the forms, and he's thinking about perfection and how we live in a world of illusion and we're stuck in the cave and all of those things that we associate with Plato. But look at Aristotle. Aristotle's like, hey, calm down. Come back down to earth, because this is where we live. And we can learn a lot about ourselves by simply observing the things that go on around us. And this is Aristotle's methodology. And in some ways, we could consider Aristotle to be not simply a philosopher, but a biologist and an anthropologist. He was an eclectic mind. But Aristotle always begins with an investigation of the world we live in as it is. And if we want to know about ethics, just as a subject, Aristotle would say, like, you study it like any other subject, you should observe the actual behavior of people living in groups. How do they behave? What do they do? What do they think is good? What do they think is bad? What can we know? What can we observe? And so Aristotle called behaviors conducive with human well-being virtues, and destructive behaviors that were not conducive to human well-being, he called those vices. Now, Aristotle begins with is the basic observation about human nature, and there is a human nature for Aristotle, a telos, an end, there's a nature of all things, right? One of the defining characteristics of human beings is that we are rational, of course, and to that extent he agrees with Plato. But also, human beings are political animals. We're social creatures. Humans naturally live in communities, the polis, and we cannot flourish in isolation. And this is a profound observation, because if we're not really isolated individuals. We always exist and come to be and mature and develop in the context of society. So if we want to understand virtue, we have to understand how deep our socialization is. Human nature is both social and rational, so the good life must be a life that fulfills both of these aspects of our nature. Really, the defining characteristics of human beings is that we are rational creatures and we are social creatures. And so how do we combine those things? So yeah, we must live rationally to be happy, but also live well with others in a community. And so this requires virtue. Virtues like justice, friendship, generosity, courage, moderation. Ethics for Aristotle is about developing character traits that allow human beings to flourish in society. So, arete, this is the Greek word, or one Greek word for virtue, and it means a trait of character manifested in habitual action that is good for a person to have. That is good for a person to have. And we have to understand that there is a good for all things. There is an end. There is a kind of plan, right? So when it comes to human beings, we have to think about our telos. What is this all for? And for Aristotle, the answer is happiness. What makes us happy? And happiness, of course, for Aristotle is a much more complicated concept. Eudaimonia is a much more complicated concept than happiness, but we'll get there when we get there. And so virtue is a trait of character manifested in habitual action that leads us to our end, that leads us to happiness. Okay, not everything we do leads to happiness. All of you know that. A lot of us engage in self-destructive behaviors, and we shake our heads and we're like, why did I do that? What am I doing? Sometimes we even know better, yet we still engage in those behaviors, and we know they're not going to lead to our happiness or well-being. Why do we do that? There is some interesting data that suggests some virtues seem to be universal. And this just makes sense to me. Wisdom, courage, humanity, transcendence, justice, moderation. Intelligence, curiosity, judgment, love of learning, Could you organize a society around stupidity? I mean, is that a good thing? I guess, I mean, we're kind of trying that today. We're experimenting. Maybe wisdom isn't great. Maybe intelligence, maybe we should be as stupid as we can. That does not seem to me to be a way to get to happiness. Courage, bravery, persistence, honesty, uh, appreciation of beauty, gratitude, forgiveness, modesty, prudence, self-control. All of these things are conducive to a good life, to a happy life, and not just for us or for Aristotle's contemporaries, but for everyone. Now, Aristotle believes that everything has a function. Virtue, audite, is the excellence in performing this function. And so, for example, we can think about a knife. Does a knife have a telos, a function? Yes, it does. What does a knife do? A knife cuts. What does a good knife do? It cuts well. Human beings also have a telos, a function. We are rational and social beings. And so our excellence is about developing the character traits necessary for rational and social flourishing. So for Aristotle, a flourishing human life is one in which a person fully develops all of their human capacities and lives in accordance with virtue. Moral virtues like courage, justice, temperance shape our desires and emotions, while intellectual virtues such as practical wisdom guide our judgment. So we have to know the right thing to do, and we have to act on that thing, right? And we have to act in a way that's habitual. Now, what's the end of all of this? What's the purpose of all of this behavior? Well, the goal is eudaimonia. And this is a great word. And it's a word that is generally translated into English as happiness. But I think happiness is a poorer concept. Happiness, really, we associate happiness with pleasure. And I think that that is part of what happiness is. It is a happy life, can be a pleasurable life, but that is not the definitive characteristic of happiness. Happiness is about so much more. So, what is eudaimonia? It is the active cultivation of virtue, of reason, and the development of one's full potential. It is the ultimate goal of life. This is a life of flourishing, of well-being, and meaningful fulfillment, rather than just fleeting happiness or pleasure. There's nothing wrong with pleasure, but you can't structure your entire life around chasing pleasure. That is not going to work. That is not going to be a successful life, all right, for reasons that we will get into. Eudaimonia is usually a pleasant life, or does have some degree of pleasure, but it's not a life lived for pleasure. It's a life lived for meaningful fulfillment. So this is the highest human good. It's the ultimate end towards which all of our actions aim. It is not a fleeting feeling or emotional state. It is a complete and fulfilled life, one that is objectively good for a human being to live. We don't pursue eudaimonia for the sake of anything else. Rather, everything else we pursue is for the sake of eudaimonia. A flourishing life is a life of rational activity in accordance with virtue, in a community with friendship over a complete lifetime. Wow, that's a lot to aspire to. A meaningful life, a fulfilling life, a pleasant life at times, but not always. Sometimes it's a life of struggle. There will be pain. There will be deprivation. But it is a fulfilling life lived in the company of others, particularly friends, because friendship, very important to Aristotle. And it's something that takes a complete lifetime to fulfill. So how do we get there? Well, we need to know the good. So there is a knowledge component. We need to figure out what it is good for us to do. And then once we figure out what is good for us to do, it's not enough just to know that. We have to habituate ourselves to do that over and over and over again until it becomes a habit. Only then do we have character. Yeah. So think about it this way. All of us are on a path. We make little decisions every day in our life, and those decisions take us in a direction. And over the course of our life, that takes us to a destination. When we make good decisions, when we do the right thing, that makes it easier for us in the future to repeat those actions. And if we do that enough, we cultivate habits, courage, compassion, right? Friendship, temperance, moderation, justice. We are better people. Alternatively, when we cut corners, when we cheat other people, when we lie, we are making it easier to repeat those behaviors in the future. And we are drifting down a path towards a place that is not good for us to be. So every day you're cultivating your character. You might not be aware of that, but you're headed in one direction or the other. And it takes a long time to enculturate a habit, but once that habit is there, it can be very difficult to get rid of. Now, that could be a good habit or a bad habit. That's up to you. You don't become a virtuous person overnight. No one does. And it can be discouraging. But you can identify those aspects of your life where you need to be a better person, and you can work on those today. You can say, I need to be more honest. I need to stop lying. I need to stop hurting the people that I care about. I need to just be a better person. And you can make a little step. You can take a little step today, and that little step today will make it easier to make a bigger step tomorrow. And over time, before you know it, you're a better person. Now, what's the intellectual component of this? It's called phronesis. And it's just, it's like Yi for Confucius, right? It's moral knowledge, it's practical wisdom. It's the intellectual virtue that enables us to deliberate about what is good and beneficial for a flourishing life. It is practical reasoning. It is based on real world experience. It is knowing how, when, and in what degree to act. It is making the right decision at the right time. This is an art. It can be cultivated. We all know people who naturally just seem to know the right thing to do, but you can do this as well. You can cultivate this in your own life. You can learn to be the type of person that has practical wisdom. Imagine a friend who's having a hard time with their kids and they're making questionable decisions. They're your friend and they ask you, do you think I am a bad parent? How would you respond? This is an interesting problem to have. You may be concerned about them. You may be concerned about their children. So in this case, you could just come out and say, yes, you're a terrible parent. That would be that would be the truth, perhaps. But Aristotle would say that's needlessly cruel. Excess truth without any kindness, without any concern for the other person. That's not necessarily a virtue. You could also say, no, you're a fine person trying to spare the other person's feelings. Would that be good? Would that be virtuous? No, that would be dishonest. You owe it to that other person to tell them the truth, to help them. So responding honestly, but kindly and constructively would be the virtue here. An answer that demonstrated phronesis might sound like this. You could say something like, I don't think you're a bad parent, but I do think you're struggling in some areas. And I think you care and you want to do better. So we should talk about it. Now, that's the kind of answer that I would aspire to if my friend came to me for advice, because I'm concerned with being a better friend. Christina says, constructive criticism is what I always do. You try, you aspire to. Sometimes we don't necessarily always live up to that. But that's okay. That's part of being human, is that it's a journey, right? All right, let's look at phronesis in action and virtue in action. What are these virtues that Aristotle keeps talking about? Let's talk about courage. So, what is courage exactly, and how do we know? Well, being a good person is not just about knowing a rule. It's about developing the ability to judge situations correctly. Without phronesis, our judgments are blind or misguided. We cannot understand true virtue. We act at the wrong time or for the wrong reasons. 3 women on a bridge. A child falls into the water. That child is going to drown. The woman in red sees the child fall in and she jumps in right away to save that kid. Is that courage? It's an admirable thing to some degree. And Amelia, you say, yeah, jumps right in. Yeah, that's I admire her initiative, and she certainly wants to do the right thing. But there's a problem that Aristotle will point out. Aristotle actually says that this is not the virtue courage. Yes, Amelia, the woman in red is being reckless. She doesn't have a plan. She hasn't assessed the situation, right? She simply is acting without thinking. And in this situation, that could even make the situation worse, because she could get trapped down in the water too. Maybe she'll hurt herself on the rocks. And now we have 2 people to rescue instead of 1 person, and that is not good. So we call this not courage, but rashness or recklessness. Now, what about the woman in yellow? The woman in yellow sees the child fall into the water and she becomes paralyzed with fear. She wants to help the child, but she just can't think clearly and she can't take an action. Well, what do we call this? This is not the virtue, it's the deficiency of the virtue, or what Aristotle would call cowardice. Are you guys seeing the pattern here? So, what do we want to do? Well, the woman in pink. The woman in pink sees the child fall into the water. She doesn't immediately rush into the water, but she looks at she thinks about all the contingencies, and she thinks about how fast the water is moving, how deep it is, where the rocks are, and she formulates a plan. Now, I don't know exactly what this plan would look like because all situations are different, but she takes the information she has, she formulates a plan, and she puts that plan into action. Now, if anybody has a chance to rescue that child, it's going to be the woman in pink. And we call this, Aristotle calls this phronesis, knowing the right thing to do in any situation. And that is courage. It is not the excess, which is rashness. It is not the deficiency, which is cowardice. It is the mean between the excess and the deficiency. That is where the virtue is. Think before you act. Christina, yes. So every virtue is the mean between the extreme and the deficiency. Do you guys see this? So there's a vice of defect, which is cowardice, and there's a vice of excess, which is overconfidence or recklessness or rashness. Now let's play a little game and see if we can think about this applied to other virtues as well. Anger. Anger is the virtue. What is the excess of anger? Well, rage. Rage is the excess of anger. That's not a virtue. The person who flies off the handle, the person who is just completely taken over by emotion, yeah, that's not a virtue. What is the deficiency of anger? Good question. The deficiency of anger is the person who simply lets every other people just walk over them, spinelessness maybe. I don't know. There's not a lot of good translations here, but you know the kind of person they see injustice and they're not moved to do anything about it, or they become the victim of people who are just taking advantage of them and they don't assert themselves. Anger is the mean between the extreme and deficiency. Ambition. Well, the excess of ambition is the person who will stab people in the back to get ahead. The deficiency of ambition is the person who just, they just don't want to better themselves. They just lay around. They're on the couch, they're not out there trying to make their life or improve their life in any way. So there's a lack of ambition there, a general kind of lack of ambition. So ambition is the mean between the extreme and deficiency. Honesty, well, we've talked about honesty. The person, obviously lying is a problem. That's the deficiency of honesty, but you can be too honest. You can disclose the truth in situations that prove to be harmful for other people. What's the excess of pride? Arrogance. That's having too much pride, right? Thinking you're better than other people. Yeah, that's having too much pride. What's the deficiency of pride? Well, again, there's a real sometimes there's a lack of good translated words, but lack of self-esteem. Yeah, the person who just they don't believe in themselves, right? This is a deficiency of pride. And then, of course, temperance is one of my favorite virtues, moderation, self-control. And we all know people that have no self-control. They have the deficiency of temperance. They just can't say no to anything. And that's a problem. But we also may know people who don't know how to have a good time. And this would be the excess of temperance, right? The excess, too much self-control is not a good thing from the Greek perspective. And so here you can see, and if you go online, you can see these things. Again, what is the virtue? The virtue is the mean between the extreme and the deficiency. Now, all a good life requires a balance of virtues. You can't just have one. You can't just be courageous, right? That doesn't work that way. So a virtuous life requires a balanced system of virtues, not isolated traits. Each virtue stabilizes and corrects the others. To have any single strength of character in full measure, a person must have the other ones as well. Think about courage without judgment. That's not good. Courage without perseverance or courage without a clear sense of your own abilities, that's foolhardiness. Aristotle also talks, humans are political animals, so we talk about the types of lives that we can live in the context of society. And Aristotle has thoughts about this. Aristotle says there are three types of lives that we can pursue, and they have relative merits. We can compare them. There's the life of pleasure, the social/political life, and the contemplative life. Now, the life of pleasure, Aristotle, not real big on this, but the pursuit of gratification and avoidance of pain, and the Epicureans will talk about this when we meet next time. And this is a form of hedonism, right? That pleasure is the ultimate good. And of course, the utilitarians agree that pleasure is the ultimate good. Aristotle says, no, a life of pleasure alone is suitable only for animals, not human beings. So a life lived for pleasure alone is suitable only for animals, not human beings. Now, better than the pleasurable life is the social and political life. And here we use our character and abilities to engage in public affairs, finding fulfillment in the recognition from others. And think about that, the recognition of other people, your friends, your coworkers, your compatriots, family members. When you are recognized, when you are appreciated, when your talents and skills are important in the context of these relationships, what a good feeling that is. And Aristotle says that's very important. But what might be even better than that is the life of contemplation. And so the life of contemplation is the highest form of happiness because it exercises the intellect. Remember, we are also rational creatures. It exercises the intellect in the pursuit of truth for its own sake. Unlike political, social, or moral activity, contemplation is self-sufficient, continuous, and intrinsically valuable. It just is. Now, in practice, and I think this in reading a lot of Aristotle, I think honestly, and Aristotle, has a kind of debate with himself about the political life versus the contemplative life. But I think that Aristotle suggests eudaimonia consists in some combination of all of these. A good and pleasurable life, public engagement, pursuit of knowledge and wisdom, and using your abilities in the service of some higher purpose, something more important than yourself. I think this, for Aristotle, is happiness. Now, Aristotle also talks about friendship. How many times have you had a discussion about the importance of friendship? What a great concept. And if you think about the role that friendship plays in our own life and our own sense of happiness and purpose, it is, man, just think about the importance of friends to your own sense of happiness. And for Aristotle, friendship is not simply a personal good. It is also a moral good. It plays a crucial role in the ethical life. Friendship, philia, is an essential component of eudaimonia. And that makes sense, doesn't it? Friends are one of the most important things in life. True friendships, Aristotle said, he argues, require, you have to have good character to be a good friend. You do. And I mean, that may be controversial. You may say, well, I have these friends and, they engage in, look, if you don't have something there, it's not something inside there, some virtue there, you're not going to be a good friend. You can't be a good friend because good friends help each other be better. How am I going to help you be better if my life is all screwed up? Doesn't make any sense. True friendship is rare, Aristotle says. And in fact, in the Nicomachean Ethics, which is, Aristotle wrote this, and we say Aristotle wrote. Most of what we have of Aristotle is notes from his students, but Aristotle wrote this for his son, Nicomachus. Aristotle identifies three types of friendships, and we all have all of these types of friends. We have friends based on utility, we have friends based on pleasure, and if we're fortunate enough, we have friends based on virtue, true friends. But those won't be very numerous. Okay. So friendship based on utility. All of us have friendships of utility. These friendships are based on mutual benefit. Individuals find each other useful for achieving their goals. Okay, there's nothing wrong with this, as long as these friendships are reciprocal in nature. As long as nobody is being used, they're not morally problematic. I give my friend something, they give me something. I help my friend, they help me. You just have to be careful to ensure reciprocity so that one party's not exploited. What's the problem with these friendships of utility? They fade when the utility diminishes, when you no longer need that friend. The friendship dies. What about friendships based on pleasure? We all have these friends. We love to hang out with these people because they make us laugh. We have a good time every time we're with them. We enjoy spending time together, engaging in common activities. What's the problem, though? These relationships last only as long as the pleasure does. And sometimes we outgrow these people, and the friendship just diminishes. Finally, there are true friendships based on virtue. This is the highest form of friendship. It is based on mutual admiration for each other's virtue and a shared commitment to living a good life. These friendships are rare, and they are characterized by deep respect, trust, and a desire to help each other grow and become better people. If you are in a true friendship, you value the well-being of your friend above your own. And your goal is to help them be a better person. Count your true friends by this definition. No way it's going to be over 5. In fact, maybe 2 or 3 tops. And like Christina said, sometimes it's just one person. But you know what? That's enough. Because this requires a lot of you. And you have to develop your virtue in order to be there for your friend, or it's not true friendship. And I mean, think about this too. The true friend will never put you in a situation that will compromise your own virtue. They're always thinking about, what can I do to help you be a better person? I'm not going to help you destroy yourself. I'm not going to help you be worse. So true friendship cultivates ethical growth because friends encourage each other to be better. I think about jealousy or envy. It plays no role. So a true friend always does what is genuinely good for the other person, even if that comes at great personal cost. Folks, seriously, this is not for everyone. If you're not ready for this, don't try it. That's my advice to you. I think it takes a certain degree of maturity and a certain requisite degree of virtue to be a good friend. Now, I encourage all of you to aspire to having good friends like this or relationships, but if you're not ready, don't try it because people will be hurt. Right? And I mean, it's like look, you can't rely on me, or I'm not in a position to, okay, there's nothing, that doesn't make you a bad person. What makes you a bad person is pretending like you're going to be there if you're not going to be there. So needless to say, a person will have very few true friendships over the course of their life. Now, Aristotle argues that strong friendships are not just a private affair, but are essential for a just and stable society. There's always a relationship between the personal and political for Aristotle, which is much different than political liberalism, where we're just individuals. We live in our own kind of silo, walled off from everything. We're just concerned with our own personal development. No, our decisions in our personal life affect the world around us in a fundamental way. Ethical relationships between individuals contribute to the overall well-being of the community. Friendship is an extension of the ethical life, reinforcing virtue and contributing to personal and communal flourishing. Practice on being a better friend. Everything else falls. You'll be a better citizen. You live in a better country, live in a better nation, live in a better community. Hard to overestimate the importance of friendship. Okay. Now, we know what's coming next because all moral theories are subject to criticism. And there's criticism here too. No, there's no universal moral theory that's going to work in every situation. And all moral theories have problems and weaknesses. So what are the objections? Well, what is moral luck? Some philosophers have recognized that virtue alone might not be entirely sufficient for eudaimonia, as circumstances and good fortune play a role in achieving a fulfilling life. One cannot exercise virtue well if one is constantly crushed by misfortune or one lives in a lawless society. I'm sympathetic to this view. I am. I think it's very difficult to cultivate virtue if society is collapsing all around you. Aristotle says, yes, luck does impact our life and life's outcomes. But eudaimonia and virtue are largely immune to fortune. Aristotle says one's virtue is the result of rational choices and consistent intentional actions. Good character is not significantly affected by bad luck. Now, the Stoics will take this even further when we talk about the Stoics. The only thing that matters for the Stoics is virtue. Virtue is happiness. And if something doesn't have the potential to make me a better person or worse person, then I should ignore it. I should be indifferent to it. And luck really has nothing to do with it. And of course, one of the proponents of Stoicism, Epictetus, was a slave. And so he knew something about moral luck. And if a Roman slave can cultivate virtue, and you think, wow, this person has no agency whatsoever in a conventional sense, but if he can cultivate virtue, so can I, regardless of the circumstance. Okay, that's a good counterpoint, right? A truly virtuous person, like a skilled archer, aims for the best action, regardless of whether they succeed or not. I know that it's not always going to work. It's not always going to succeed. There's the machine, the institution. It's going to stop me. But I'm going to try anyway. because that's what virtue is. That's what it means to be a virtuous person. It doesn't mean, oh, we always succeed in what we do. Sometimes we know we're going to fail. I mean, it's like Seneca and Nero, or like there's only so much you can do. But we can always maintain our own integrity. That's something we have control over. No one can make me a bad person. I have to do that myself. How about this? The situationist objection to virtue ethics. Okay, this is from contemporary psychology, and it's interesting. Ethical situationists maintain that behavior is influenced much less by character and more by the circumstances of a situation. There have been psychological experiments where people are shown to be much more likely to act altruistically, such as turning in a lost wallet full of cash, if previously they just found a dollar bill moments before, right? So you find a dollar, oh, that triggers altruism. So the situationist says our behavior is really influenced by the context of events, the environmental triggers, not so much by character. I think there's a lot to be said in favor of the situationist argument. I mean, studies are studies, right? But think about it this way. The person who aspires to cultivate virtue is probably aware of this. They're probably aware that our decisions are influenced by environmental circumstances. Just having that knowledge can help me be a better person. In fact, knowing the environment and the situation plays a role is all the more reason to develop our character. Then we will be much less likely to capitulate in the face of unfavorable circumstances or social pressure to engage in wrongdoing. Look, we know that social pressure can compel people to conform, to comply, to do terrible things. Think of the Milgram experiments, controversially, the Stanford prison experiment. Social pressure matters. Like, I know that it matters. And so that's all the more reason to cultivate virtue. So when I'm placed in those situations, I don't capitulate. Because I know I am going to be placed in those situations, right? For example, a person who is inclined to drunkenness can develop self-control by habitually resisting the temptation to drink. Like, they know that they're going to be in situations that they're going to be triggered. They understand that. They understand they're going to be triggered. They understand that they're going to be placed in a position where they're going to have to, face this temptation. So the goal is, over time, cultivating new habits, so at least you'll be much less likely to drink, even in the presence of psychological triggers. It's difficult, but that's understood. Further, by developing the virtues, we become more capable of discerning what things are actually desirable and what things should be avoided. Ultimately, we can come to understand what is truly in our interest and the interest of others, and become less attached to that which merely appears to be desirable. Not everything that is desirable is good. And so one of the burdens of being human is learning to differentiate between the things that I desire and the things that are actually good for me. And virtue theory solves that problem. Once I know that something is good for me, I can work towards that. Once I know that something is harmful, I can work to avoid that. Even if the situationists are right and character traits don't influence behavior as much as virtue ethicists claim, We can still aspire to cultivate virtue and act on them when we can. In short, most of us genuinely want to be a good person. Most of us genuinely, we want to be a better person. We want to be a good person. For example, it's not surprising to see superheroes in comics and movies display virtue, display virtuous character traits. Why? Because that's the type of person we all aspire to be. We want to believe that good people have good qualities that generally lead to good behavior, at least most of the time. After all, like Uncle Ben says, with great power comes great responsibility. If our actions affect other people, and they do, then we are morally responsible for the consequences of our actions. We are. And even if we're not superheroes, even if we're not superheroes, we all have a responsibility to use what power we have to benefit others and to avoid causing harm. That is the kind of person we should all aspire to become. Fantastic. Wow. Oh, man, I had fun. I did. What a great topic. And I hope that you guys can take away just some practical understanding of this and apply it in your own life. And we're going to continue as we talk about the Epicureans and the Cynics and the Stoics. Yes, more practical advice for you. Didn't you weren't when you signed up, you're like, wow,